Aristotle lived and wrote at a time when there were no sharp disciplinary boundaries between philosophy and science. In the physics, the line between metaphysics and physics is blurred. Perhaps the best way to think about this work in contemporary philosophical terms is to say that it is Aristotle's attempt to explore the metaphysical foundations of natural science. Aristotle opens with a statement about scientific knowledge. Such knowledge is knowledge of the primary causes and first principles of things. But how do we arrive at these primary causes and first principles of things? Well, Aristotle proposes a method. We start with commonplace human experiences that are familiar to us, those things that he calls more perspicuous to us, more perspicuous to us. We start there and we proceed to things that are more perspicuous by nature. These are the things that we can readily point to because they're apparent and obvious to our senses. We readily perceive them, those things that are more perspicuous to us. By contrast, the things that are more perspicuous by nature are the clear explanation of things, which would be in terms of principles, basic propositions, or the well-defined notions of science. We know from the posterior analytics that these things will have the character of universality and necessity, and thus should be simpler in nature than complex and confused everyday sense experience, and therefore more perspicuous and better known by nature. Now, philosophers of nature prior to Aristotle make contrarieties their starting points. That is, they set up as their starting points or fundamental principles opposed pairs of opposites, such as hot and cold, full and void, rare and dense, up and down, front and back, etc. Aristotle concedes that there's a certain reasonableness to this procedure, which is derived from the requirements of a starting point itself. A starting point needs to be prior to everything else in science, and therefore cannot have anything prior to it. Everything else must be understood to be derived from the starting points as their elements. Contrary things cannot be derived from one another, so it's possible for there to be a number of contrary elements, each of which is equally primary. And yet there's another more fundamental reason why previous natural philosophers have focused upon contraries, which concerns the nature of natural change. And here is Aristotle's view that natural change concerns the coming to be of things. Natural change concerns the coming to be of things. Now, things always come to be out of something. Things always come to be out of something. In other words, they don't simply pop into existence from nothing. Things always come to be out of something. Moreover, things do not come out of each other randomly. So we can add to this, not randomly. That is, one thing doesn't come to be out of just any random thing. You don't get rabbits coming to be out of, roses, for example. One thing just doesn't come to be out of any old random thing. Instead, one thing or quality comes to be out of something that is in some way opposite of that thing or quality. So instead of randomly, it comes out of something that is in some way the opposite. One thing or quality comes to be out of something that is in some way the opposite of that thing or quality. For example, something must become pale out of something that was in some way or other not pale, or become musical out of something that was in some way or other not musical. And the same holds for ceasing to be. So there's a parallelism between coming to be and ceasing to be. And it also holds for compound as well as for simple things, Aristotle adds. Aristotle concludes that the majority of his predecessors all held structurally similar or analogous positions, insofar as each of them selected a subset of all the contraries that there are and made these into their starting points. Now, having established that and why the starting points of a philosophy of nature must be contraries, Aristotle moves on to the next issue, which is to determine which particular pairs of contraries are the appropriate ones to start from. Which particular pairs of contraries are the appropriate ones to start from? First, he observes that if we assume that being is knowable, there must be a finite number of contraries. The number, however, must be more than one, for the suggestion that there's only one contrary in nature is absurd. Contraries come, by definition, in pairs. And likewise, there must be more than merely two contraries, because it seems that contraries by nature have nothing in common. But if they really have nothing in common, how can they even interact? Instead, it seems that it belongs to the nature of contraries to each be contrary influences on some third thing. As Aristotle observes, quote, "Love does not battle with strife or make something out of it. Rather, both act on some different third thing." Love, that's on page 474 in the right-hand column. Love does not battle with strife or make something out of it. Rather, both act on some different third thing. These observations suggest that it's necessary for the natural philosopher to posit what Aristotle calls, quote, "something of a different nature underneath the contraries." Something of a different nature underneath the contraries. So, if you have two contraries, call them P and Q, that are opposed to each other. I use this little dotted line to signal their opposition. The claim is that these are both contraries of some underlying thing. And it's because of their shared influence on this underlying thing that they can actually interact with one another. If we didn't have this, there would be no interaction between P and Q because they're just radically incommensurable with one another. They're totally different. There's no basis for causal interaction between the two. And so it has to be the case that there's some third thing that is the ground for their interaction with one another, as they are both contrary influences on this third thing. So this would be the something of a different nature underneath the contraries. X here is neither P nor Q, but some third thing different in nature from both. But if this is the case, then the contraries cannot actually be real starting points. Aristotle explains this, page 477. That first complete paragraph there, beginning at the second sentence. "For we see that the contraries are not the substance of anything that exists. And a starting point should not be said of anything as an underlying subject. If it were, there would be some further starting point for that starting point. For a subject is a starting point, and it seems to be prior to what is predicated of it. Moreover, no substance is the contrary of another substance. How then could a substance be derived from non-substance? And how could non-substance be prior to substance?" Contraries are not the substance of anything that exists. For example, a cast iron stove can be hot or cold, but neither the heat nor the cold are the substance of the stove, which it would be closer to say perhaps that the substance of the stove is cast iron, although as we'll see for Aristotle there is a deep question about what actually is the substance of the stove. Is it the cast iron, or is it the form of stove, the kind of shape that it has that makes it essentially a stove as opposed to, a girder on a skyscraper or something like that. So leaving that question to one side for now, we can at least agree that the contraries, the hot and cold of the stove, are not the substance of the stove. That's the point he's making here. Nor is, for example, the sharpness or the dullness of a blade the substance of the blade, which would be something like the steel or perhaps the shape or the form that makes it into a blade as opposed to a piece of silverware. So it's rather the case that contraries are said of a thing as an underlying subject. We say this blade is dull or this stove is cold. So dullness is said of blade, cold is said of stove, as well as, of course, of other things and so forth. However, this suggests that the underlying subject should be considered the actual starting point rather than the contraries. The latter, the contraries, are merely qualities of a substance which is ontologically more fundamental. The substance is ontologically more fundamental, therefore. In addition, Aristotle notes that substances are not such as to admit of contraries. Well, one can set a dull blade next to a sharp blade. It's the dullness and sharpness that are the contraries here, not the blades themselves. It seems like a kind of a category error, in other words, to claim that, this dry erase marker is opposed to this dry erase marker. Of course, you could say that, let's see, maybe it's better to do red and green since we're used to thinking of these as opposite. Of course, you could say the red and the green are opposed to each other, right? But the substance of the two markers is not opposed to each other. It doesn't even make sense to say. That's the point. So substances are not such to admit of contraries. Moreover, the contrary to a substance, if there were such a thing, would have to be a non-substance, which would also have to be that out of which a substance comes, since we've said that things come out of their contraries. But that implies two absurdities. First, that a non-substance is ontologically prior to a substance, in essence, that nothingness is ontologically prior to being. And second, that substance can come out of non-substance, in essence, that something can arise out of nothing. So again, it would follow that substances cannot have contraries. That would be an absurdity on this way of thinking. After his critical survey of his predecessors' accounts, Aristotle offers his own account of natural change, beginning with what he calls coming to be in the broadest sense. Coming to be in the broadest sense. In natural change, there are, according to Aristotle, two factors. The thing that becomes and what it becomes. The thing that becomes and what it becomes. A natural change occurs when the thing that becomes changes into what it becomes. And we can say of these things that they're simple or compound. So we can talk about the thing that becomes and what it becomes as man or non-musical, or compound, a musical man. We speak of changes in different ways. For example, we might say, that man became musical, referring to two simple things, man and musical. Alternatively, we might say, that non-musical man became a musical man, referring to compound things, non-musical man and musical man. In the latter case, we make explicit what remains and what does not in the change. So when we say that non-musical man became a musical man, we make explicit that the man remains, but the quality of being non-musical does not remain. And from such considerations, Aristotle draws the conclusion that in all cases of coming to be that have this form just described, there must be an underlying subject that is the thing that becomes, which is one in number, but two in form. There must be an underlying subject that is the thing that becomes which is one in number, but two in form. This is a very important Aristotelian account of natural change, cases of coming to be. There must be an underlying subject that is the thing that becomes, which is one in number, but two in form. And if we ask, what does in form mean here? This means in account, he says. In account. Suggesting that the definition that spells out what it is will change as non-musical and musical, which are two different forms, have two different accounts or definitions. Thus, whatever comes to be is a compound. A compound of form and then an underlying subject that changes form. Aristotle notes that when we use locutions, like, take a kind of algorithm here, x became x from y, this formula. When we say x, things like f became x from y, the y usually refers to what does not remain. So, for example, when we say the stove cooled, it's a way of saying more succinctly, the stove became cold from being hot. The stove became cold from being hot. And so the hotness here is what does not remain. That's in the typical case. However, it's not the case when y refers to a constitutive material and x refers to the particular use or arrangement of that material. So we can say things like, the statue is made from bronze. So this thing became a statue from bronze. And in that case, of course, the bronze remains in the statue. So it's not always the case that the y term will not remain. Aristotle remarks that comes to be is said in many ways. Things may be said to come to be X something, right? So it's come to be something. It came to be a statue. It came to be X. Or something may simply say, we may simply say something comes to be, full stop. So, the house came to be. The house was built. Aristotle claims that the latter possibility, though, is actually the exclusive province of substances. So we should think of the paradigm case as something like a man came to be or a horse came to be. In cases in which we say that a non-substantial thing comes to be something, so for example, we say that color is faded, that color has become pale. If we say something like that, the color became pale, there clearly needs to be some underlying subject, a substance that the qualities are said of. So, Socrates became pale from drinking the hemlock, from lack of sunlight. Socrates became pale. There's an underlying subject, Socrates, that is the thing that underlies the change. Substances themselves come to be from another subject, another predecessor substance. For example, plants from seeds, or the human being from another human being, the horse from another horse, their parent. There are many different forms of coming to be simply, including change of shape, growing, taking away, putting together, and altering in respect of their matter. What then determines what comes to be and how it comes to be? And here Aristotle makes a distinction between instances of coming to be that are coincidental versus those that are substantial or essential. So you have the general category of comings to be, and we can distinguish there between the ones that are coincidental versus substantial or essential. The kinds of changes that involve contraries, the kinds we have been discussing up to now, are merely coincidental comings to be. For example, the musicality of man. So these are the ones that involve contraries. Example of musical, coincidental comings to be. The contrasting substantial change is one that's rooted in the substance, essence, matter of the thing itself. So things like the very physicality, or these are examples, I should put e.g. The very physicality or animality of a man, when that comes to be, this is involving a substantial change because that's rooted in the very essence of what it is to be a man. The underlying substance or matter or essence, which Aristotle refers to as the this something, is a distinct causal principle of coming to be. In other words, in addition to the change of form of an underlying subject, it's also possible for there to be a natural change that stems from the underlying subject itself. So you can have, on the one hand, this picture of the underlying subject that undergoes contraries, and on the other hand, the idea that there's a change that stems from the coming into being of the substance itself. Next, Aristotle attempts to confirm his theory of change by showing that something like this theory is necessary in order to overcome the paradoxical position of Parmenides. Recall that Parmenides had argued in this way. Premise 1. What comes to be would have to come from either what is or what is not. Premise 1, what comes to be would have to come from either what is or what is not. Premise 2, it cannot come from what is because what is already is. Premise 2, it cannot come from what is because what is already is. Premise 3, it cannot come from what is not because from nothing, nothing can come. Conclusion, hence there is no coming to be. So once again, what would come to be would have to come to be either from what is or from what is not. It cannot come to be from what is because what is already is. It cannot come to be from what is not because from nothing, nothing can come. Hence, there is no coming to be. Now, Aristotle regards this argument as an error, and he replies that this is like saying that a doctor can't build a house because he's a doctor rather than a house builder. Or that a doctor can't be a patient because a doctor acts on a patient and not vice versa. In such examples, it's clear where the error lies. We're erroneously assuming that a doctor can't be anything but a doctor. That is, that a particular this something, someone, only is correctly described under one specific narrow description, namely doctor, and that this doctor can't also have been a carpenter. Although, of course, there might be many doctors who, in their spare time or as a hobby, like to build things, even houses. So we're ignoring that a doctor can be a doctor in one respect and a house builder or a patient in another. Likewise, Aristotle will say that a thing can come to be in one respect and not come to be in another. In what way can there be coming to be from what is not? Answer, when a thing comes to be from a privation, coincidentally. When a thing comes to be from a privation, coincidentally, there can be coming to be from what is not. For example, A particular man is coincidentally non-musical, the privation of being musical, because he lacks that form. However, of course, he still is, in that he exists as an underlying subject, the very subject who continues to exist or to be when he acquires the form of musicality by taking piano lessons, for example, or guitar lessons. So what is, namely musicality, comes to be not from what is not full stop, but from what is not musical. And what is not musical is something that is, namely the man. Alternatively, it's possible for what is to come from what is, provided that they're different particular individuals. So Parmenides writes that horse cannot come from horse since it already is, but only if by horse he means the species horse. If one means that the foal comes from the mare, then what is can come from what is, no problem. Another way to solve the problem would be to say that a man can both be and not be musical at the same time, but in different senses. That is, one can say that the man is not actually musical, but he is potentially musical. This relies on Aristotle's important distinction between actuality and potentiality. Actuality versus potentiality. Something can be in two ways. Being, in other words, can be a potential, or being can be actual. Potentialities for Aristotle are not mere privations or absences. For example, the potential of a man to become musical, to learn the piano or the guitar, etc. This potential is something real in him. In the normal case of things, right? If the man has like a minimum of, let's say, aptitude and has fingers and can see and so on, or even if he can't see in some cases, we have Ray Charles and so forth, Stevie Wonder, one can learn to become musical. That's a real potentiality in him. It's real power in him. For example, it's something that a bird lacks. Maybe a bird's a bad example. Since birds, I guess, are musical, often if they can sing. A bat. Okay, it's a power that a bat lacks. And the reason I want a flying animal, because I want to say that the contrast is with the way in which the man lacks even the potentiality to fly under his own power, as a bat does. So a bat has the potentiality to fly under his own power, but doesn't have the ability to be musical, unless you consider, I suppose, the bat screeching as music. Potentialities belong to the underlying matter of a substance for Aristotle. They belong to the underlying matter of the substance for Aristotle. So we'll say more about matter and form later, but for now we note that Aristotle says that the matter, which is the repository, so to speak, of the potentialities of the thing, quote, is very nearly and in a way is the substance. Is very nearly and in a way is the substance. Aristotle here associates the matter with the underlying nature of the subject which desires the form. This explains the way in which potentialities reside in a subject. For example, musicality resides as a potential in the man because of his particular nature, the stuff of which he is made. We might say, the neurological capacities of the brain. But also, we don't mean here just flesh and bones, but the particular organization that involves an embodied rationality, that involves an organization of matter in such a way that the brain can produce consciousness at a certain level of sophistication. Of course, you could rearrange the same matter in other ways. By, for example, blowing your brains out with a firearm, you could rearrange the matter of your brain in a way that no longer has the potentiality to become musical. So the particular organization that involves an embodied rationality, that's what we're talking about, that can learn the piano. And that particular organization of a kind of embodied rationality, an embodiment of the material, the particular material of the man, is able to produce music under the right circumstances, but not produce bark, like I'm talking about the bark on a tree, or I suppose the bark of a dog too, or leaves or acorns. First discussion question. Does Aristotle provide an account of change that is adequate to answer the Eleatic's arguments that change is impossible? Why or why not? Once again, first discussion question. Does Aristotle provide an account of change that is adequate to answer the Eleatic's arguments that change is impossible? Why or why not? Okay, so this brings us to Book 2 of the Physics. Aristotle begins Book 2 of the Physics by distinguishing between two sources of coming to be. On the one hand, there are things that exist by nature, by which he means that they each have within themselves a starting point of change and rest. They have within themselves a starting point of change and rest, and therefore they exist by nature. So, for example, a woman has within herself a starting point of change in the sense that in the natural course of things, she will grow up, reach maturity, grow old, and eventually die. She will undergo certain natural changes in the course of this, out of herself, getting taller, undergoing puberty, menstruating, and later going through menopause, perhaps getting pregnant and delivering and nursing babies. Meanwhile, she will exhibit within herself a starting point or principle of movement and rest. So she will have within herself a principle or a starting point of perceiving, reacting, thinking, reasoning, communicating, walking, running, lying, changing yoga positions, nursing a child, lying down to rest, sleeping, etc., etc. All coming from within her own nature. So natural things in this way have an intrinsic principle of change. However, there are also extrinsic principles of change as well, by things that are acted upon from outside themselves. And all human handicrafts and manufactured goods are produced through a principle of change extrinsic to them, by human beings acting on them from outside of them. So we have, of course, a tree has various intrinsic principles of change by which it grows, matures, dies, just like the woman does. But the tree, of course, has intrinsic principles that lead to it forming bark and leaves and seeds, fruit, and so forth, that are part of the natural intrinsic changes that it undergoes. But then, of course, it can also be acted upon by, say, a woodworker who can cut down the tree and shape the wood into various pieces of furniture, for example. And the woodworker, therefore, is acting as an extrinsic principle of change because she is acting upon the wood from the outside. So these facts provide Aristotle with an initial characterization of what nature is. Nature is an intrinsic principle or starting point of change. Nature is an intrinsic principle or starting point of change. Note that nature in this sense doesn't refer in the first instance to the natural world or the universe, but to natures in the plural. So things have a nature, and this is the primary sense of nature. For Aristotle, only substances have natures in this sense. A thing's nature is what determines it to be the particular type of substance it is. And it's possible to explain a thing's characteristic behavior in terms of its nature. For example, a fire's tendency to move upward, humans' tendency to talk, etc., etc. These things can be explained by reference to the nature of these things. And it's not necessary from Aristotle's perspective to prove that things have natures. He doesn't seek to prove that things have natures. On the contrary, he takes this to be obvious. So we see on 482 in the left-hand column, right in the center of the column. Now, to try to prove that there is such a thing as nature would be ludicrous, for it is obvious that there are many things of this sort, and to prove what is obvious by what is obscure is the mark of a person who is unable to distinguish what is self-evident from what is not. So that there are natures is taken to be obvious and self-evident. But what is a nature? What kind of ontological reality is it? And this is less obvious. What is a nature? Aristotle considers several alternative answers to this question. First, some say the nature of a thing is the matter that makes it up. The matter that makes it up. This is understood on the analogy with the products of the various crafts. So, for example, the nature of a wooden bed would be wood, since that's ultimately what constitutes it. The wood is what enables the bed to behave as it does. For example, to be light enough for one or two people to move, yet sturdy enough to support one or two people's weight. And if you planted the bed, moreover, and it still had the power to send up a chute, this would be wood, not another bed. So that's one possibility for what the nature is. If we ask what it is, question mark. One possibility is that the nature is the matter of the thing. By extending this analogy to natural things, one could say that the nature of a thing is whatever primary material element or elements are making up the natural substance, whether this be earth or air or water or something more fundamental underlying these. Thus, the primary matter would be the nature. However, in another way, the nature is the shape or the form of the thing. This is another possibility for what the nature is, the shape or the form of the thing. And once again, one can use the analogy with the products of craft. Isn't the nature of a bed, in a sense, the shape that's distinctive of a bed? It seems quite natural for us to say that that's the nature of the bed. The bed is a thing that has this shape. And by analogy, in the natural case, it appears that the matter or the stuff that makes up an animal, for instance, is specific to its form. This is towards the bottom right where it says 193b on page 482 in the right-hand column. What is potentially flesh or bone does not yet have its own nature and does not by nature exist until it gets the form that is in accordance with the account, by virtue of which definition we say what flesh or bone is. So in other words, if you just say flesh or bone, you haven't yet specified what its nature is, because is this the flesh or bone of a bird or of a cat or of a human being or of a pig? It's only once we say what the form is that this flesh or bone exists in that we can say what its nature is. That's the point. And Aristotle concludes from this that it's really the form rather than the matter that's truly the nature. So in the next paragraph there, he says, now the form is the nature rather than the matter, for each thing is said to be what it is when it exists in actuality rather than when it exists potentially. Again, a man comes to be from a man, but not a bed from a bed. That is why people say that the shape is not the nature of the bed, but the wood is, since if the bed had sprouted, it is not a bed, but wood that would come to be. But even if this, i.e. the shape is an example of craft, still shape is also a nature, for a man comes to be from a man. The form provides the toward which of the matter, is what he's saying here. So, on the top left-hand column of 483, moreover, nature in the sense of coming to be is a route toward nature. For it is not like healing, which is called a route, not toward the healing, but toward health. For healing must go from the healing art, not toward it. But this is not the way that nature is related to nature. Rather, the growing thing, insofar as it grows, goes out of something into something. What then is it that grows? Not what is growing out of, but what it is growing into. Therefore, shape is a nature. In other words, the matter of a substance, for example, an animal, is a potentiality in it to have a certain nature. But that means the potentiality to actualize a certain form. As flesh and blood exists as a potentiality to actualize the form of a particular type of animal, a particular species of animal. And the wood is selected to be made into a bed because of the form that the bed is supposed to take. So it's directed in that sense. Of course, it's not directed intrinsically, but extrinsically, but it's still directed by the craftsperson toward the form. The matter is selected for the sake of the form. So Aristotle seems to favor the form as the nature in the primary sense, although matter is certainly involved as well, but more in a support role here. Aristotle next proposes to consider, quote, how the mathematician differs from the student of nature. Page 483, how the mathematician differs from the student of nature. Both the mathematician and the student of nature are concerned with such things as surfaces, volumes, lines, and points, which are understood by Aristotle to be properties of natural bodies. However, the mathematician separates them, Aristotle says. That is, in modern parlance, he abstracts from the surfaces, volumes, lines, and points. Or rather, I should say, he abstracts the surfaces, volumes, lines, and points from the concrete body in thought. He abstracts from the concrete body the surface, the volume, the line, the point of the body, the points of the body. Aristotle sees the main difference between the mathematician and the student of nature being that the former deals with shape in abstraction from movement. In other words, the student of nature studies movable things, whereas the mathematician studies the properties of things in abstraction from their movement. For example, the nature of sphericality apart from the movement of the heavenly spheres is what the mathematician is concerned with. According to Aristotle, natural things are spoken of in two ways, namely the form and the matter. Natural things are spoken of in terms of the form and the matter. Natural things like surfaces, volumes, lines, and points would be paradigms of form. It's clear that these can be studied without reference to movement. However, there are other natural things that cannot be studied without reference to movement. So flesh, bone, man, and the snubness of a snub nose. These pertain to the matter of things. And this raises a puzzle. Page 483 in the right-hand column towards the top, second paragraph. Since nature is spoken of in two ways, form and matter, we must consider it in the same way we would investigate what snubness is. Hence, neither without matter nor with respect to matter only. And once again, one might raise a puzzle about this too. Since there are two natures, which is the concern of the student of nature? Or should he be concerned with the combination of the two? But if with the combination of the two, then also with each of them singly. Then how does it belong to the same science to know both of them, or to different ones, different sciences, to know each singly? So Aristotle raises three possibilities here for how one should understand the science of nature, how one should understand natural science. Is natural science something concerned exclusively with form? Or is natural science something that's concerned exclusively with matter? Or the third possibility, is it concerned with both? And if number three is the correct option, this raises the question whether there's more than one science of nature, one for form and one for matter. Now, on behalf of the second option, that it's concerned exclusively with matter, Aristotle observes that many of the original students of nature, including Empedocles and Democritus, seemed to be concerned exclusively or almost exclusively with matter rather than form. However, Aristotle takes the arts, or perhaps it would be better for us to say the crafts, as his model. So we're using art in the sense not of fine art or making pictures and sculptures and things like that, but the broader sense of art where it means all of the handicrafts. That's what we mean by art here. So art, in this sense, it is said, imitates nature. Art imitates nature. And Aristotle makes that observation. Art imitates nature. This is what it's said. This is what is known to be the case. And if this is the case, Aristotle infers that art imitates nature. Perhaps we can use the case of art as a guide to how the study of nature should proceed. So, some examples. Aristotle observes that the doctor knows both health, which Aristotle construes as a form. So health is like a form that a body has. So the doctor knows that the form that the body is supposed to be in. The way, for example, what the appropriate heart rate is for a healthy person would be part of this. What the appropriate blood pressure would be for a healthy person. So he knows health in the sense of that form, the appropriate structuring or arrangement of things like beats of the heart that are the form of a healthy person. He knows that. And he also knows bile and phlegm, which Aristotle construes as the matter in which health resides. Of course, we'd have a broader notion of this today, but we get the basic picture, right? So the doctor has to understand some things about, blood, for example, has to understand some things about mucus and various things that compose the body. That's the material of which health or sickness will reside. But he also needs to know something about the way in which these things are formed, shaped, or arranged together in a healthy person. So the doctor has to know both the form and the matter, in other words. Likewise, the builder must know which form to give to a house and which materials, which matter are appropriate for holding that form. So obviously the builder has to have some idea of the blueprint of the house to know what the form is in which those materials are supposed to be put together, according to the architect. And then also which materials are appropriate for holding that form. To use bricks as opposed to water, for example, as the way to hold the form of the house. So again, the builder, like the doctor, has to know both form and matter. Hence, it would seem by analogy, if in fact nature is like art, because art imitates nature, it would seem that by analogy, the science of nature also needs to be concerned with the form and the matter. Continuing this analogy, it would also belong to the science of nature to know what something is for. To know what something is for. That is the end of a thing. Just as the movements of a doctor qua doctor end in the restoring of health to the patient, and the movements of a builder qua builder end in the completion of a house, so too does every continuous process of movement in nature end in a last thing, which is what the movements are all directed toward. So change is a continuous process of movement that is aiming towards an end in the sense of a last thing, which is like something like the culmination, the completion, or the perfection. It's not really an arbitrary stopping point to the movement, like a person's sudden death, but rather the best end state, the completion or perfection, in the sense of a thing being completed or finished, as when the doctor's movements are completed or finished when the patient is restored to health, when the patient is cured. As the builder's movement is finished qua builder, when the house is standing and matches what the original architect envisioned. So that is the end, the last end of the thing, the completion of the thing. Aristotle observes that there is an interconnection between the form, the matter, and the end in the case of the arts. Page 484 on the left, he says, there are two arts that control matter and have knowledge. The art that uses the product and the art that directs its production. That is why the using art also directs in a way, but with the difference that it knows the form. Whereas the art that directs by being productive knows the matter. For the helmsman knows and prescribes what sort of form a rudder should have. Whereas the carpenter knows from what sort of wood and by what sort of processes it should be made. In the case of artifacts, then, we make the matter for the sake of a function, whereas with natural objects, the matter is there all along. Further, matter is a relative. Different form has different matter. In the case of the arts, we make a product to serve a certain function, which is to say we make it for a certain end. That end or function just determines the form that the thing is to have. That's why he says the helmsman knows what form the rudder is supposed to have, because he knows what the function of a rudder is. So the end or function determines the form that the thing is to have, and it also determines the materials that have to be used for that product, because in order to function, it has to be some strong form of wood in order to function as a rudder in this case. Or to take a traditional standard example, the end or function of a knife is to cut. To perform its function, a knife must have a certain range of shapes. For example, it can't be shaped like a block of cheese. It also has to be made of certain materials. Again, cheese won't do to make a knife out of. The form and the matter are selected and determined based upon the end for which the craftsman is making the knife, the function it is supposed to serve. So this model, taken from the domain of the arts or the crafts, is determinative for Aristotle's way of thinking about natural things. In Book 2, Section 3, we see the application of the analogy he sees between the arts and nature in Aristotle's theory of natural explanation, his theory of the four causes. So here's what he says. This is beginning on page 484 in our text in the bottom left-hand column. Now that we have drawn these distinctions, we must look into how many and what sorts of causes there are. Since the aim of our enterprise is knowledge, and we do not think we know a thing until we have grasped the why of it, which is to grasp its primary cause, it is clear that we too must do this with respect to coming to be and ceasing to be and every kind of natural change, in order that by having knowledge of their starting points, we might try to bring under them each of the things we are seeking. And then he enumerates the four causes. 1. In one way, that out of which a thing comes to be and which persists is said to be a cause. For example, the bronze is said to be a cause of a statue. The silver is the cause of a bowl, and the genera of these is also the cause. In another way, it is the form or paradigm, and this is the formula of the essence and its genera. For example, the ratio 2:1, and in general number, is the cause of the octave, and the parts that are in the formula. 3. Next, the primary starting point from which change or rest originates is said to be a cause. For example, someone who has given advice is a cause. The father is a cause of a child, and in general, what does is a cause of what is done, and what alters something is a cause of what is altered. 4. Finally, something may be called a cause in the sense of an end, namely what something is for. For example, health is a cause of walking. As evidence, when we ask, why is he walking, we say to be healthy. And in so saying, we think that we have given the cause. Likewise, for anything that is intermediate between the initiation of the movement and the end, for example, the slimming, purging, drugs, or medical instruments, all these things are for some end, although they differ from one another in that some are activities while others are instruments. So the first thing to take note of in this passage is that the term cause is used in a broad sense, in which it's close to the term explanation. So Aristotle is concerned with the four ways or the four aspects of explaining a thing. And these are as follows. So we have first that out of which a thing comes to be and which persists. that out of which a thing comes to be and which persists, which is the matter or the material of the thing. And the example Aristotle gives would be the bronze of a statue, the silver of a bowl, and so forth. So that's the first thing. That out of which a thing comes to be and which persists, the matter or the material of the thing. The second is what he calls the form, the paradigm, or the formula of the essence. In the clear case would be something if there's if there's actually a mathematical formula like the 2-to-1 ratio in the octave. The definition, the listing of the intrinsic or essential parts of the thing, that would also be the cause. It's a way of defining the thing in terms of the form or the essence that it has. And then the third is the primary starting point. From which change or rest originates. So someone gives you a piece of advice and that causes you to change the way you're living. A father, in his imagining, is the cause of the child. Of course, we would say the father and the mother are the cause of the child. The starting point of the process of pregnancy, of the change within the mother's womb that leads to the child, is the father and mother having intercourse with each other. And then for the end, or what something is for. In Aristotle's example, so someone takes a walk in order to be healthy. The end, the purpose, we would say in this case, for their walking is to be healthy. The walking exists for the sake of health. The end of the walking is the health. What it's for is the health. So we can think of this as the four ways in which to answer the question, why is this thing? Aristotle is clear that the why of it. He says we've come to understand the causes when we understand the why of it. So this is the kind of the key question here. Why is this thing? And so with regard to this first, we can say it answers the question, why is this thing, for example, stable or unstable, or sturdy or fragile, or wet or dry. And these are just examples, so we could say et cetera, right? So that out of which a thing comes to be or persists, the matter is that thing that answers the question, why is this thing stable, unstable, sturdy, fragile, wet, dry, and so on. And this is what is traditionally known under its scholastic name, which was the material cause. This isn't Aristotle's term, but this is the traditional scholastic term. The material cause is this one. Next, the question is answering, why is this thing shaped, formed, or constituted in this particular way? And this is the formal cause. Why is this thing shaped or constituted in this particular way? And that's the formal cause. The third we could see as answering the question, why is this thing at all? Or why is this thing at all? Why does it exist in the first place? And this is what is traditionally known as the efficient cause. Why does this thing exist at all? Why does it exist in the first place? That's the efficient, the answer to that question is the efficient cause. And then finally, we have why in the sense of for what purpose. Does the thing exist? And this is the final cause. So there we have the four causes here as Aristotle describes them in this passage I just read. And here are some of the ways in which you might think about these four causes based upon how they would answer the question why, which Aristotle says is what an explanation is supposed to do, answer the question why. But this question why is complex. It has these different dimensions. And thus we get different answers to different dimensions of the question why. And this is what has traditionally been known in the scholastic tradition as the material, formal, efficient, and final causes. Aristotle's four causes. So because there are these four types of causes or explanations, it follows that there are in fact several causes of the same thing. Several causes of the same thing, and he says, and not coincidentally. In other words, the complete natural explanation of a thing will be complex and will involve all four of these dimensions. The equivalency between the terms cause and explanation is also clear from the fact that some causes, according to Aristotle, are more proximate than others. This is a matter of explanatory relevance. So he says on page 485, bottom of the left-hand column up to the top of the right-hand column. Further, there are coincidental causes and their genera. For example, the cause of a statue is in one way Polyclitus and in another way a sculptor, because being Polyclitus is coincidental to the sculptor. The genera comprising that which coincides are also causes. For example, if a man, or more generally an animal, were considered to be the cause of the statue. And some of the things that coincide can be more remote or more proximate than others. For example, if a pale man or a musical man were said to be a cause of the statue, this would be more remote than Polyclitus or a man. So it's clear from this passage that a cause is coincidental in the sense if it could be a part of the explanation of a thing, but it's not essential. So if a particular sculptor happens to be pale, you could say that a pale man was the cause of the statue, but it's not essential to the explanation to mention that the man was pale. And Aristotle advises that we should always seek the most precise cause of each thing, as he says in the bottom of 484 of the right-hand column. Now, some other distinctions here in causes. We can also speak of the particular causes of things or the generic causes. So the former the particular cause refers to an actual causal explanation of a particular thing that's actually given. So, for example, we say Phidias the sculptor made the statue of Athena in the Parthenon. That is, it was Phidias, not Polyclitus the sculptor, who made the statue of Athena in the Parthenon. So that would be the particular cause. But also we could refer to a general type of causation. And these are generic causes, like sculpting makes statues. So here we're saying sculpting makes statues as opposed to medicine or house building. It's sculpting that makes statues. It's not house building that makes statues. This is a kind of generic causal explanation as opposed to the particular cause where we say, no, it was Phidias who made the statue of Athena in the Parthenon. But also we could just say generally sculpting makes statues. So there's particular and general causes. Another distinction is between actual and potential causes. The difference is that actual causes have to exist simultaneously with the thing that they're causes of, but potential causes do not. So, for example, the actual cause of the physical therapy Grandpa is getting right now is his physical therapist. If the physical therapist should give himself a heart attack and die in the midst of Grandpa's physical therapy, the physical therapy would cease as well. The actual cause of this particular activity of house building is a particular house builder. And if he should likewise die, the house building, this particular house building would cease. But the potential cause of a house, a carpenter, doesn't have to exist at the same time as the house. Many a carpenter has died and yet their product continued to exist. So we're talking about actual causes, we're talking about things that are obtaining at the particular moment of the activity. When we're talking about potential causes, we're just talking about a relationship that is more separate, but that nonetheless is a real relationship of explanation between a cause and an effect. Okay, this leads to the second discussion question. Second discussion question. Does Aristotle provide a correct account of what a natural scientific explanation is in terms of the causes of a thing? Does he include all and only the real causes of a thing? Does he overlook any causes? Does he add types of causes into his account that should not be considered real causes? Explain your answers. So, second discussion question, does Aristotle provide a correct account of what a natural scientific explanation in terms of the causes of a thing consists of? Does he include all and only real causes of a thing? Does he overlook any causes? Does he add types of causes into his account that you think shouldn't be considered real causes? Explain your answer.